Hello again. It's a pleasure to sit here with you and share a talk with Lorna. I think Lorna's probably going to be holding my end of the bargain up a little bit, as I'm wilting a little bit. We do work quite a lot together, actually collaborating across communities to aid us with our information collection and analysis, and quite often that is led by Lorna. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction and lead you into Lorna, who's going to give a main body talk using a Canadian example. I wanted to start off with getting the thing to work. Here we go back one. What is health technology? I've just chosen some words from the World Health Organization, just to give some quick read through slides. A health technology is the application of organized knowledge and skills in the form of devices, medicines, vaccines, procedures, and systems developed to solve a health problem and improve quality of lives. I think, remember the last bit. Solve a health problem and improve quality of lives. And I think that very last bit is really key, and that's why, leading into perhaps why we're having this talk, because the quality of life, information around quality of life, I think is core to a lot of what we do here. So what is health technology assessment, HTA? HTA is the systematic evaluation of properties and effects and or impacts of health technologies and interventions. It covers both the direct intended consequences of technologies and interventions and their indirect unintended consequences. So when we're working in HTA, we're going to be looking for the benefits to a patient population, but we also have a dual responsibility there to make sure that we're looking at the negatives. And I think that's also something just to touch on really quickly as we're going forward. It's an important part of providing a balanced HTA submission, because many HTA agencies seem to have the view that patients are going to ask for whatever's available regardless, and quite often that's not the case. We do turn down a willingness to participate and actually support access if we feel it's detrimental to the patient groups we represent, and if we can evidence that. So I'll continue to flick forward so that I don't hold too much time up. The challenge. Now, limited national budgets, there is no more money, and the high cost of novel therapies, and limited trial data collection of quality of life. Here it comes again, and activities information. Activities information, real world data, real life information, how people go about and deliver the activities and are able to carry out their activities of daily life. So this is proving a challenge in accessing new effective treatments when it comes to justifying the benefits of a treatment. And I'll quickly flip forward. So why involve patients in HTA? And I think we just headed that off. I probably made myself a few notes while I was looking at this. Here we are. First and foremost, patient groups can keep evidence of a solution to a health problem and the improvement to quality of life again at the forefront of the process. In other words, we should be in the centre of the room here, and quite often we're not. We're quite often included in tick box processes, and we should actually have control over the agenda. I think I took that quite nicely from Peter earlier when we were chatting about this. Why involve patients in HTA? In rarer cancers, there's often gaps in the information available, collected at the evidence base, because the small numbers are involved, although CLL is allegedly the most commonly diagnosed leukemia in the adult population of the Western world. It's still an orphan disease, it's still a rare disease, and it still requires multinational collaboration to get enough people into a trial. And quite often, rarer diseases are prejudiced by their ability to complete trial data, to reach trial endpoints, etc. And, qualitative patients' evidence and experiences can provide real-life perspectives on the value of a treatment. Real-world information, real life. This was brought up by Arne and Kater earlier a couple of times, and it led quite nicely into. So HTA bodies, we must remember, are mandated to evaluate real-world evidence, not only clinical trial data. And clinical trial data's information does tend to be skewed, and we're finding out at the point of HTA that insufficient amount of information is being collected at that point to justify that, and this is where we can get involved to make a difference with how we collect that information from our patient groups so that we're providing that real life information. It's collected, it's evidenced, and the real world data. And this is an area where we need to start looking at collaboration as well, with just not just collaboration across our patient groups to increase numbers, but also with other stakeholders. So I'll skim through very quickly, if I can remember to use just why involve patients in it. So I think I probably covered that. Provide real-life qualitative information to strengthen the case for access. Real life refers to patients' actual experience of living with and dealing with a disease. There's pros and cons. I've put down there, there's two main HTA models. I really am going to follow on, and Lorna is going to give an example of what's most commonly used, the approach in Canada and UK, which is cost efficacy appraisal, where the quality adjusted life year, and the ISA threshold determines the most important is more cost efficacy versus the other model, which is relative effectiveness, which most of you guys will be more familiar with in Europe, and I'm not going to really touch on that. So I'll pass it over to Lorna, so Lorna can kick off with an example of a quality-based appraisal and how we do it. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. So I am going to look really in depth at what the Canadian perspective looks like, what the Canadian system looks like. This is not so that you know at the end of at this session how you could come and help me in Canada. It's really not. It's just an example of where we fit into the system, so you realize how important it is to actually understand how the HTA process works where you live and where you help your patients. So this is what happens in Canada. First, there's Health Canada, and what they do is actually review a drug to make sure that the drug is clinically effective for patients, right? They look at the efficacy. And so they approve a drug for use in Canada based on that information. They're not looking necessarily at the economics of the drug, just clinically, does it work? Does it provide a benefit? And then there's a Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. What they do then is set kind of like a guideline, a lower threshold and a high threshold of what the pharmaceutical company could charge for that medication in Canada, and also work with them on how long their patent will last for. There is variability depending on the need for the drug and the disease that's being treated, to make sure, if there's a lot of medications already, the chances of them getting a longer patent are less likely. But then it goes through a process called PCODR, which is the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. It's government, so they like lots of acronyms. So what happens with the PCODR review is they look at 3 different components of data that's submitted. So they're looking again at the clinical evidence. So they again look at whether the drug is effective, but they also look then at patient submissions. So they look at information that comes from groups like ours, where we present the patient perspective. They also consider the economic input of the drug. So they're looking at those 3 different situations, and then they make a recommendation. PCODR, even though that's where we actually have most of the input from a patient organization, purely makes recommendations. At the end of the day, they don't actually decide whether or not the drug is approved, okay? But then it'll go to the provinces. So Canada is quite a big country, size-wise, so 10 provinces and then 3 territories, and each of them have a role to play in deciding what they're going to pay for within their own geographic area, okay? And then it goes to a pricing alliance board, which actually negotiates what the price of the drug will be for Canadians. The provinces participate in there, as do the pharmaceutical funders, and they look at the cost and come to some kind of applicable, something that works for everybody on how much they're going to charge for this drug. And then it's still, once they have made that decision on what they think they're good with for a price, it goes back again to the provinces, and they decide whether they're actually going to list it on the formulary and cover it for patients. Now, what happens after Health Canada approves the drug? Officially, it is available in Canada, but the only way to access it at that point is when you pay for it yourself. If you have a lot of money in your bank account, feel free to do that. The second is if you have private insurance that will cover the cost of the drug once it has Health Canada approval, which does happen sometimes, you may be able to get the drug that way. All right, and the only other option at that point is if the pharmaceutical company still has some kind of benefits program available to get early access to a medication. So this, like I said, P-coder is where we have our main impact, but we also do have a choice, usually, to participate with the provincial levels are looking at whether they want to approve the drug locally. We can go back to them and have a say, basically, usually in a written format, though sometimes there are in-person discussions. And again, once they made their decision at the end of the day, if our previous work, which is mainly written documents, doesn't work, then we start with the meetings to see if we can get listing decisions changed. Because, you know, if they approve the drug, we're happy, usually. So Canada, oh, by the way, I just wanted to mention on that previous slide, Canada, because of the process, it is in depth. It traditionally takes 9 to 15 months later to get a drug through this process than it does in the US and it does for the European Medicines Commission. So it's a long process, even though it allows for a lot of input, it takes longer to do that. So when I put the map up here just to show you from a Canadian perspective, you're looking at all these different provinces and the territories. They each decide by themselves what they want to provide on the formulary for free for people that live in Canada. It is not equally funded across the country. It does matter where you live. So if you look on the far side here, if you look at the yellow, red, and then those little green, blue, and orange things on the side, so you're looking at the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, Prince Edward Island. Those areas of our country, if you're taking an oral cancer therapy, it's not paid for by the government. So as soon as a pill is available as something that your chemo is a pill or a new targeted therapy as a pill form, you have to pay for it or find private insurance to cover it. The provinces do not cover that. If you live on the western side of the country, those other provinces shown there, in that case, it is covered. So, you know, if you get put on ibrutinib, for instance, you could get that drug covered by the government. If you're living on the other side of the country, you need to pay for it or find some other mechanism to pay for your drug. This comes into play a lot. We do actually have patients that move. They will get up and move, and our country is big, so they're moving thousands of miles away from any kind of support systems they may have in the medical community that they're familiar with, just so they can get access to their medication. You'll also see reasons then where, you know, you look at fludarabine-based treatment for CLL on the eastern side of Canada that's still administered through IV, even though pills are very, very common as a form of treatment, because as soon as you decide to take it in an oral format, it's no longer covered. Now, I put this up here. These are all the disease indications and the number of drugs that have been going through the P-coder process by tumor site over the last few years. And the only reason I put it up here is to show you how high the number of drugs are for lymphoma and myeloma. It's how they group them together compared to the other tumor sites. There has been a lot of activity, which is great. We're happy to see that. It also makes us really, really busy. So, like I said, P-coder assesses the drugs and makes recommendations to the provinces and territories to help guide their drug funding decisions. So they don't actually make a decision at the day, they just make a recommendation for a decision. So it was designed to bring consistency and clarity to the assessment, because what used to happen is all of the provinces would do this independently. So we as patient organizations can register to advocate, but you must have a mandate that predates the group's decision to register with P-coder. So you can't just decide when a drug comes to market that you're like, okay, I'm going to fight for that drug when a drug comes to the P-coder approval process, that now I want to join and I want to make a statement about this drug. You have to pre-register. You have to have a means of communicating with a wide number of patients, basically. You must represent the patients or caregivers affected by the cancer that's being treated with the new medication, and you can't have funding from a single funder that's more than 50% of your budget. So every PCODER submission that we have to give a conflict of interest that shows exactly how much funding we get from pharma companies, industry, right across the board, and how much of a percentage of our budget that represents. That information is mainly public in Canada, so it's not a shock. It's just so you're aware, we're always putting that out there. So to provide the patient perspective, we are given a very specific form to fill out. So it's not like we can just put whatever we like. We're restricted to gather certain types of information and present it in a maximum of 8 pages. They are very picky. If you give them 9 pages, the 9th page gets thrown out, right? So you can only give them 8 pages. So these are the areas that we're allowed to talk about: general information, the disease and the current management, the drug under the review, and additional information if we have any. Now, this is what sometimes can be tricky. We get 10 business days to gather all this information, collate it, and submit the form to the government. That's all they guarantee that they will provide for us. Sometimes the pharma company submits a little bit early and asks for a later submission date, so it gives us a little bit extra time. Most of the time, we're reliant on our pharmaceutical partners to let us know that a drug is going to be submitted shortly so that we can start gathering the information early. Otherwise, it means in the office, we drop everything else we do to figure this out. So most of the time when we're gathering data, we do it through 2 methods. 1, we put out an online survey, and 2, we do telephone interviews. So we are trying to gather as data from as many people as possible. For most people, the online survey is easiest, and it's by far where we get our biggest numbers because it's less time consuming for us than doing those telephone interviews. Even though they're vitally important when we're working with 10 business days, it's not always feasible to do a lot of them. So we recruit patients and caregivers. We have email lists specifically for this advocacy work. We use social media. We promote on our website. But we do a lot of work with international patient organizations who help us promote our surveys. And the reason we do this is because Canada is has a large geographical area, but relatively small population for the size of the country, definitely. Clinical trials do not happen at the same rate in Canada as they do in a lot of other countries, especially the United States. So it means that sometimes we have a really hard time finding the patients that actually have experience with the drug being evaluated. So if we push it out to other countries like the US that have already often approved the drug, or Australia, other parts of Europe, usually we can get better real-world data of what it was like for the patient. The PCODER is happy for us to submit international perspectives, but they still want us to break out what the Canadians thought, right? So there's always a requirement. It's not necessarily a requirement, but they like to see what Canada had to say. So these are things that we can cover in our submission. What we cannot talk about is the clinical data. So we can't, we can learn all kinds of things about the drug from the company, but we can't necessarily talk about it. What we have to talk about instead is what the patients actually think. So it's the patient's real-world experience. What is it like to live with the disease generally, right? And regardless of whether you've had this treatment or not, what is your experience? What are the treatments you've had to date? What's been the impact for you? And then a separate section on caregivers and their impact. And then there is a very specific section on patients themselves who have had experience with the drug. And then we can talk about their side effects, whether they thought the drug was good or bad, whether they would recommend it to someone. We can talk about those kinds of things, but we cannot then go back and pull anything out of that clinical trial data, all right? So a lot of the submission is it's quantitative data, but we do include qualitative data because quotes have a huge impact in communicating an experience better than we can with numbers. But we do put a lot of quantitative data in there because it does have an impact where the people reviewing think it's far more clinical, I guess, in a way. And they like to see all of those numbers about how many people had this experience versus the percentage that had a different experience. How would they rate their experience with a certain drug or treatment to date? How many people think it's important for there to be more drug options for their particular disease? I have a few quotes here just so you can, I won't read them because we just really don't have time, but they will be included so you can look at them later. Okay, so we get in this process and you can see in this 3.1 is really the submissions is where we have a role to actually submit some data on the patient experience. One thing with the patient, submitting the patient experience in that 3.1, clinicians also have the opportunity to submit. So doctors can give their opinion, again, it's in a form, it's a different form than what we have, about why they would like to have this drug to treat their patients. Clinicians are busy, so we actually coordinate those for them as well. We take their data, we collate the forms, we make sure that their information is included because it does have some important ramifications. The clinician data is still in a pilot project, so it's very new, so that's partially why we help and make sure that the information is getting in. Just one step back here, because I skipped that slide. So once they post their initial recommendations, we then have the chance, if we don't like what they've recommended, to appeal. If you do not participate up front, you cannot appeal later. So you have to be part of the whole sequence if you want to participate. From a Lymphoma Canada's perspective, we have a mandate right now to fulfill this process for every new drug that comes through for lymphoma. Whether it turns out that we want to support the drug or not doesn't matter. We're still going to put the input in there so that the patient is represented regardless of what we think. It's all honest. We report exactly what the patients think, but it's in there. So what is good is that they recognize, from a Lymphoma Canada perspective, the breadth and depth of the patient input, which was well structured and organized, and it gave them a much deeper understanding of patients' experience. It's all good that they really like our data and the way we present things. It doesn't mean our drugs always get approved by any means. Right? And this is the first step of the process for us. So once we go through this and we figure out, what's going to happen from a national basis, there is further education, definitely, and further advocacy needed to get the right end result. One thing I do want to say, I know I'm taking up our time, just really quickly, we share our data. So the patient data that we collect, we share with other groups. We do make efforts if we know that the UK, for example, has something coming up where they're going to have a review and we're looking at the same patient population. We will integrate all of our questions into one survey so patients are only answering data once. We don't give the individual data out, but we will definitely share the finished reports. If anyone wants to see them, we have them for every drug that's been through the Canadian process.
Thank you, Lorna. You haven't left me much time, so I'm going to skim through. I don't know if people can hear from here. I'll have a look at a UK example. With a lot of the way we go about things is very similar to the Canadian model. We are the social health care model. We used to have one National Health Service. We now have three, and that's multiplied up the amount of work that we have to commit to when it comes to providing the patient voice and perspective towards health technology assessment appraisals. So I come from the little corner down there in Wales. We have the All Wales Medicine Strategy Group, AWSMG. One thing I never expected to have to learn all these acronyms. Scottish Medicines Consortium is a devolved National Health Service and adjudicates for Scotland. And then we have NICE. Many people would have heard of NICE. Many people watch what NICE are doing, and they appraise for NHS England and, strangely, also NHS Wales. Basically, the message just to come from that is we actually have to, as the patient group representing the CLL population in the UK, have to replicate 3 times, go through 3 different processes, and it's provided challenges. At the moment, we found, I think, it's been a protracted process, and there's a high demand on patient group resources. Our 3 different systems have been evolving and changing shape, and some do take, the Scottish system maybe is a little bit more patient-centric and takes on board real-world information and gives more allocation to the decision-making process. But ultimately, we are struggling, even at the UK, to gain access for the high-risk 17B group in most need for this treatment, ultimately because of costs and because of the information available for this to go through. We talked about trial endpoints. These treatments are very successful, and it's causing uncertainties because they're very successful and they're ultimately quite expensive. So how has this affected access for us using this as a test case? At the moment, we have partial access in Scotland to ibrutinib for 17B, but believe it or not, in England and Wales, we are still waiting, and we've been working on this process now for 1.5 years. So do we have restricted access? We still don't know, but we've been working on this for 1.5 years. So as I've said, much variation in the HT processes across different countries. What do I need to know? There's much variation in the HT processes across all of our countries. So what do you need to know? Understand your own country's HTA processes and the roles available to patients and patient groups to become involved. I mean, ultimately, you need to be able to represent your group, but the problem you have to consider is that high demands on your own resources. We're already under-resourced. We all struggle to do what we're doing. So there is a value and a benefit, and the message I just wanted to bring was collaborating together. Lorna shared the fact that we do share with our information collecting and our assessment to help each other because of our limited resources. And if you do partner with others, for example, in the UK, the CLL Support Association often partners with Leukemia Care, and Zack, who works on the HTA, and I often work on the HTA there. That extends our resources and enables us to share skills, and again allows us to increase patient-centric evidence to make sure the correct information is provided by a large enough population who have experiences with that technology. It also helps to show that there is unity of opinion, and it strengthens the patient voice. So you don't have to undertake this on your own. We are all leaders of groups that represent the CLL population. We can collaborate together to assist with this. And I'm going to quickly whiz through if I can get this to work. Conclusion. These are earlier notes. Much needed, available and effective CLL treatments must become consistently available and affordable to all groups and population that the treatment has actually been licensed for and has indications for. I know you talked about access earlier, Charlotte, but in the UK, we have a similar access situation to ibrutinib, for example, because of cost and because of the level of information that's collected on real-life data and real-world data at the point of trial as some of the Eastern European countries. Patient group participation and training in HTA, along with collaboration with all stakeholders during development processes and real-world data collection, is becoming increasingly important. I'll leave that as a conclusion that is from Jan and you, Patty. I hope my inputs haven't confused things, but the main point is that it's extremely important that we find a way to make sure that we provide patient experiences, collect those experiences, share those experiences, and participate in these processes, and keep us in the centre of the room and keep patients, in the foreground. Because quite often, if we are being involved, we are being involved in tick box processes, and we can help shape these processes as well by being involved in these processes even pre HTA work, in terms of when agencies are actually shaping their engagement policies and their standard operating procedures. Thank you for listening, and Lorna, most importantly, thank you for your example.
Yes, thank you. I'm Natasha from Spain. I'm here on behalf of IAL. Thank you for the best practice sharing. I just want to mention, as I was listening the different experience in the different countries, I was more and more worried about disparities across different countries. As we learned before with Charlotte from Lymphoma Coalition, there are certain countries where even access to essential medicines can be a nightmare. So HTA patient group involvement, it's a need. Real life evidence building from patient groups, it's a need. Engaging with policymakers and other stakeholders, it's a need. But how we as coalition, as a global entity, can really help those who start from scratch in those countries where this cannot be assumed at this level because they are much more behind. So I would love to hear from you, you know, an advice for those who need to think in this, but who are fighting with disparities, with inequalities, with access to essential medicines, to diagnosis, and probably are at the beginning of the patient group organization.
Well, Natasha, if I may comment on that, in my country, Czech Republic, the HTA is still knocking on the door, but round the corner. So in the meanwhile, we are trying to facilitate through the Hematology Association some informal roundtables of the respective stakeholders. So it hasn't any sort of official value, but at least to get the stakeholders together and to try from somewhere the evidence from the medical society, the perspective of the patient organization for the patients, so the payers. So this is starting on the occasion of, let's say, local hematology congresses. This is a good opportunity to invite them and to discuss. That's the starting point we can do.
Just to add one thing, we have shared our data too. I know CLL PEG shared data with Jana to help her in that process as well. So even if you don't have the capacity or know where to start with surveying your own patients, you can look at the data that we collected from other countries and use that as a starting point with your local stakeholders as well about, you know, this is what patients' experience is like.
Yes, absolutely. This is also the problem of the small volumes of patients. So we, thanks to these patient networks, can utilize the data of those organizations who have robust evidence and robust data, and it's a patient data, you know.